In this video, we're going to look at the lives of young people in Nazi Germany, and we're going to specifically look at the methods in which the Nazis attempted to influence young people in the country. Now, from the beginning, we need to emphasise a key point. Now, the Nazis provided elaborate mechanisms to control every aspect of young people's lives in the country. And this revolved around education and leisure time. This wasn't just a strategy to target, for instance, schools. This was about winning the hearts and minds of an entire generation in order to secure the future for the Nazis and Hitler's overall aims. So let's have a look at the methods for indoctrinating the young people of Germany. And let's be clear that indoctrination is a more complex term for that notion of brainwashing. So we're not going to use the term brainwashing because it's much too simple. We're going to focus on indoctrination. And right from the very beginning, the Nazis used a variety of methods and techniques. We're going to look at those in a moment, but as mentioned already, this was about winning the hearts and minds of young people. This was about securing the future for the Nazis. And they targeted this in a variety of different ways. We're going to look at schools. And they went even further to target their leisure activities, what they did after school or before school or even during a weekend. We had different groups that included the Hitler Youth for boys and the German Maidens League for girls. Now these often revolved around fun activities that engaged children, and that helped to create this sense of belonging. And that sense of belonging was important for young people. The fact that they received uniforms and they were actually involved in kind of a club, that they were all collaborating to something. They felt as though that they were serving a higher purpose for making Germany great. So it shouldn't be underestimated how varied these methods were. But we're going to look at some of those ideas in detail. Now, another key point to mention just at this stage is that this was all about indoctrinating young people about Nazi ideology. And when we're talking about Nazi ideology, we're talking about their aims and their beliefs and their ambitions and what they stood for. This is what they were trying to achieve, to indoctrinate young people so that they believed in them. Ultimately, this would help the Nazis to ensure obedience for the future. And by obedience, it could mean by ensuring that the Nazis had support, but it could also mean ensuring obedience for when war was to come, because Hitler knew that due to his policy of wanting to take over countries in the east of Europe and potentially Russia, obedience was essential for young people in Germany. So let's have a look at step one, and this revolves around controlling education. As soon as Hitler got into power in 1933, he made those teachers who were politically unreliable, for instance, those teachers who weren't wholehearted supporters of the Nazis, he made them resign. This was to ensure that the teacher was entirely committed to the beliefs of Nazism. Also in 1933, Jewish teachers were banned from teaching German children, that in line with the Nazi belief that Jewish people were racially inferior. And in addition to that, the Nazi Teachers League was set up, and it ran political education courses for teachers. They even went on military-style training in order to attempt to indoctrinate teachers to believe in the Nazi aims. Still looking at education, old textbooks in schools were thrown out, and teachers had to follow a strict curriculum that emphasised Nazi ideology. Remember, that revolved around things like Nazi aims, beliefs, and their ambitions. And so in the subject of history, they would teach this idea that there's always been a struggle between nations, there's always been war between countries, and that due to the superiority of the German and Aryan race, Germany has always been a very strong country. They'd learn in geography this need to have pride in Germany, but they would emphasise this idea that Germany was too small and that they needed Lebensraum, this Nazi idea of Lebensraum or living space. And this revolved around having to take over countries like Poland and Russia because Germany wasn't big enough, when in fact, of course, it was. In physics, they'd learn about the science of firearms and aerodynamics, and they'd learn about radio communications. Because they knew war was coming, they wanted to make sure that their young people knew all about the science of firearms and how they worked. In maths, they'd learn about this idea of a social arithmetic, and when there were sums, they'd ask things that would emphasise, for instance, 10 evil Jews have 1,500 coins. How many coins have they got between them? Or, for instance, they might ask, in this example here, the cost of keeping a mentally ill patient alive in an asylum, because the Nazis wanted to get rid of those people who were mentally ill or even disabled. So I just want to emphasise here in PE how 15% of all lesson time was PE. They wanted to make sure that children were ready for war, so there were lots of PE, and of course finally in biology they would study race, and they would make up ideas and suggest that the Aryan race was stronger than other races. This idea that African people or Asian people were somehow weaker, and therefore Nazi Germany deserved to take over countries because they were racially superior. So in step 2, the Nazis actually created specialist schools, and this revolved around developing military education and about future leadership for the Nazi Party. So there's a strange term here, this NAPOLA. The NAPOLA military cadet schools, they were set up by the SS and the SA for military education. So this was about developing leaders who knew how military tactics, again because they knew war was coming. In addition to that, they also had the Adolf Hitler schools. And the Adolf Hitler schools, they were set up to develop future leaders of the Nazi Party. So they would receive further education about how to lead people and how to achieve the aims of the Nazis. However, it must be said that these specialist schools, they were a failure on the whole because neither were successful. By 1939, there were only 16 of these NAPOLA schools and only 10 Adolf Hitler schools. And then finally, in step 3, there was leisure time. Now, the Hitler Youth, as already mentioned, this was about military training for boys. And during that military training, they would throw grenades, fire guns, learn military tactics and how to read maps. This was about preparing boys for future war. In total contrast to that, the German Maidens League, this was about domestic training for girls. And when we're talking about domestic training, we're talking about things fit for the home. So cooking, sewing, how to become an effective mother, for instance. And then finally here we've got holiday camps. Sometimes the Nazis would provide holiday camps which were very popular for boys and girls and very enjoyable.